want to welcome everyone to the annual meeting of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield. We're waiting for more attendees to enter and to be allowed into the Zoom. So if you'll just be patient for a few more minutes, we'll be started very soon. Thank you. Again, I want to welcome everyone to our annual meeting of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield. I use the term annual very optimistically because, as most of you know, it has been probably about 3 years since we've been able to have an open meeting. Due to the pandemic, due to many other changes that have occurred over the last 2 to 3 years. As many of you know, the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield has as its mission to protect movable and immovable cultural heritage during times of armed conflict and natural disaster. Cultural heritage includes, and we focus mostly on tangible heritage, includes museums, archives, libraries, monuments, and heritage sites. We work with the US government, we work with the US military, we work to raise public awareness, and we work with our partner heritage organizations. Together, we strive to protect this heritage during times of armed conflict and, as I said, natural disaster. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm currently located on land just north of the city of Chicago, that at one time was the land, the ancestral home of Native American tribe known as the Potawatomi, before their forcible removal to the West in 1833 under the Treaty of Chicago. This reminds me also to acknowledge the terrible loss of life and devastation that's being caused right now in Ukraine. We acknowledge, first of all, the loss of life, the injuries, the displacement of people, and the refugees who have been forced to leave their homes. Along with that, of course, we have seen attacks on civilian infrastructure and civilian objects, hospitals, shelters, refuges, schools, and other forms of civilian infrastructure. This is something we very much deplore and we find very alarming, particularly also with the possibility of spread outside of Ukraine itself. But of course, this is not the only armed conflict that we've seen in the last several years. Starting with Afghanistan, Iraq in 2003, Georgia, Yemen, Syria, Ethiopia. Unfortunately, the list goes on. And very closely connected with attacks on humans and attacks on civilian infrastructure, we also see attacks on cultural heritage. Cultural heritage forms the memory of people. And very often it is not enough for an attacker to erase people. It also seems to be necessary for them to strive to erase the cultural memory of people as well. It is our goal here today to discuss issues of cultural heritage preservation during armed conflict. What has been changed over the last several years, how we have come together with other organizations, as well as the government and the military to improve protection of cultural heritage during armed conflict. I want to thank, as we start, in particular, a few people. First and foremost, Cori Wegener, who was the founding president of the US Committee of the Blue Shield and served as its president until 2013. We will hear more from her in just a few moments about the history and background to the formation of the US Committee. I want to thank also and acknowledge Nancy Wilkie, who was the second president from 2013 until 2020. As many of you know, she passed away just a little over a year ago, as well as her sister, Cindy Stark, who had served as the webmaster and tech guru for the US Committee. It was very unfortunate this happened within about just over a year. And I acknowledge that it created many problems of our organization. We miss very much Nancy's leadership, her contributions, her knowledge, her worldwide experience. I worked with her on many committees, and I will say that anytime anyone brought up cultural heritage in any part of the world, she always knew the people who were working on the ground, and she also knew the heritage and the history of the people in those places. So we do want to pause to acknowledge her passing and the great loss, both on a personal level, as a friend, and also as a leader for the US Committee. I want also to thank Cori again for her work in organizing the program today and her assistance with Brian Daniels, whom you will hear from tomorrow, who will also serve as the Vice President of the US Committee. Several other current and past members of the board are on the program, and I encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat so that we know who you are and we can acknowledge your service, and thank you for that over the last several years. I also want to thank University of Georgia, Thomas Cooper Jones for his help in setting up the technology for this Zoom meeting, and James Reap, who is a current board member and also professor at the University of Georgia, for making these arrangements for us. And particularly, I also want to thank Karen Hutchison, who is the executive director of the US Committee. She's been with us for almost exactly a year now. We could not do anything that we have managed to do in the past year without her help. So I'm very grateful to her as well. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Cori, who graciously agreed to make a presentation, as I said, about the history and background to the US Committee. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patty. So as Patty mentioned, I have a brief presentation about sort of the history of how the US Committee of the Blue Shield got going, because we have some folks with us today who may not be as familiar with that. And then for the second half of the presentation, Patty's going to take over to talk more about things that we've done in the more recent past and where we're going for the future. So let's see. All right, and as usual, technology is not agreeing. There we go. So just a little bit about the history of USCBS. There have been a lot of efforts to sort of rally the troops, so to speak, sorry for the military euphemisms, to get the United States to ratify the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in Armed Conflict. But I believe that the real galvanizing moment for the cultural heritage community, as well as the US government, was probably the US invasion of Iraq and the looting of the Iraq National Museum, which you see here in this photo in 2003, just a few weeks after the invasion. The images that came across in the media were really devastating. And in some ways, it really brought together both the museums community and the archaeological community who'd been working on this for a while, but also organizations related to libraries, archives, and all manner of cultural heritage. And this kind of media also sort of helped galvanize and elevate the concerns for cultural property and armed conflict with the US government, because while the US always maintained that it followed the implementation of the 54 Hague Convention as customary international law, it became really obvious both at home and around the world that the US had not ratified the treaty, and there were a lot of questions why. And images like this, headlines like "The US-led forces leave a trail of destruction on one of the world's most important archaeological sites," really helped to raise that to the highest level. And so in order to try to push the area along of implementation of the Hague Convention, ratification, and then recognizing after the US invasion of Iraq that we had a real dearth of expertise within the US military and not very much understanding of what the international treaty on the Hague Convention involved. We formed the US Committee of the Blue Shield, bringing together a number of different organizations and colleagues around the world, or with the International Blue Shield, as well as in the United States, to try to achieve some goals. So we actually founded the US Committee of the Blue Shield in 2006 as a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which is a little bit different than Blue Shields around the world do it. But here in the United States, we realized that nonprofit status was going to be important for us. Here's a list of our founding members. The requirement, and you'll hear from the head of the Blue Shield International, Dr. Peter Stone, in a bit, but at the time and even today, the way that a national committee of the Blue Shield gets started is by gathering together organizations that mirror the International Committee of the Blue Shield's 4 pillar organizations for libraries, archives, museums, and I forgot the 4th one. Listen to me. It's IFLA, ICA, ICOMOS, Monuments and Sites is the 4th one. Apologies. So you see here the prize letter that we finally got about a year later from the International Committee of the Blue Shield, recognizing the US National Committee. So we had to set forth some goals about what we wanted to achieve, even as we were creating the US Committee of the Blue Shield. And you see here, one of the main ideas was that we would lobby for ratification by the US Senate of the Hague Convention. We wanted to promote the Hague Convention and other legal protections for cultural property, both domestically and how we would work internationally. Coordination with the US military was very important. We wanted to try to train US military units who were preparing to deploy during that high op-tempo period in the 2000s. We wanted to create a big database of volunteers, people from all types of professions within cultural heritage, as well as the public who cared about preventing damage to heritage and conflict. We took seriously the imprimatur of the charge of the Hague Convention to raise awareness about the treaty and to disseminate information about the treaty. We knew we needed to educate the public, the cultural heritage profession, as well as the military. And then finally, to provide advice and assistance to other cultural institutions, organizations who were worried about planning for emergency response and for situations of armed conflict. So finally, after a vigorous lobbying campaign, which was led by Dr. Patty Gerstenblith and a few others, we finally saw the hearings with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then the consent to ratify in September of 2008. And then the US government deposited the instrument of ratification at UNESCO on 13 March 2009, making it official. So immediately though, while we were doing that, we were also training US military personnel preparing to deploy to Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places around the world. And over the years, we've tallied it up, and USCBS volunteers have trained more than 2,000 US military personnel over the years. And I'll say primarily those are probably US Army Civil Affairs, with many exceptions, of course. And this is just kind of a montage of various trainings that we've done at the Smithsonian, at various US military installations as units were preparing, at museums that offered to host the training, etc. And then something that we've been very involved in over the years is the creation of cultural heritage inventories and sharing that information with militaries and other types of organizations that might be in a position to use that information to protect those sites. And so we really kind of got started with that with the Libya no strike list that was provided prior to Operation Unified Protector in 2011. And that work has continued even up to the present day. And you see here on the right, a meeting that with the discussion at NATO about the 1954 Hague Convention and the protection of heritage sites. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Patty Gerstenblith to continue about what the USCBS has been up to since about that time. Patty?
Sure, thank you, Cori. That is a very helpful introduction. We have, over time, developed several key initiatives. Some we have accomplished, some we want to continue. What Cori is showing here is that we were involved in the adoption, the enactment by Congress in 2016 of the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act, which, among other things, imposed import restrictions on the import of illegally removed cultural materials from Syria during the conflict. It also, next slide. It also established the legislation established the Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee, which coordinates throughout the US government on foreign international endeavors by the Department of Defense, Department of State, Justice Department, Homeland Security, Smithsonian, and other federal government agencies to coordinate their activities abroad to protect cultural heritage. And the US Committee of the Blue Shield is named in that legislation as a consulting body for the CHCC. And one of our goals over the next few months will be to increase our involvement in the CHCC as well. We're working on new legislative initiatives. Part of that would be to strengthen the CHCC, but also equally or more important is for the United States to take up consideration of the second protocol to the Hague Convention. As Cori mentioned, we ratified the convention in 2009, but did not ratify either of the protocols, and ratifying the second protocol would be a major step for us to take, particularly as at this point, most of our major military partners, in particular the United Kingdom, which ratified all three instruments in 2017. It is important for the United States to be in coordination with our military allies and partners. So we all are subject to the same rules of armed conflict in terms of how to proceed and how to protect heritage. We also want to continue. I'm not exactly sure what the subsequent slides are that Cori has. So let's proceed and see what we have. Yes, okay, so we've undertaken several awareness raising activities. Many of these have been in partnership with the Smithsonian Institution, University of Pennsylvania Cultural Heritage Center, and sometimes also the US Department of State, and sometimes also other NGOs such as the Archaeological Institute of America. What you see here are two guidebooks that were prepared. These are small pocket guides that fit into your pocket that were distributed to US, Iraqi, and Kurdish forces first before the attack on Mosul to recover it from the Islamic State, and later in the case of Raqqa. These booklets were produced in English, but more importantly in Arabic and Kurdish as well, to be sure that they were accessible to everybody. They proved to be very popular amongst the military. What do you have next? We also, in particular, again, working with the military, picked up on the idea that Laurie Rush started in 2003, which is to create playing cards. And here you see our most recent deck of cards, which were distributed to US Southcom. We also have partnered, as you'll see, with the American Institute for Conservation. And we have representatives from the AIC on the USCBS board as well. So these cards illustrate heritage, both immovable and movable heritage, and again, are distributed to US military, and they have sort of taglines on them, as you can see, reminding people how to protect heritage and also to be aware of the different forms that heritage can take. Next. We have participated, several of the board members have participated in conferences. We do a great deal of speaking, both in the United States and in other countries, particularly with the use of Zoom that's been facilitated. But USCBS board members have also just participated in two documentaries. You see here on the left, one called The Destruction of Memory, based on a book by Robert Beavens, produced by Tim Slade. This has been shown all over the world. And a more recent documentary on the life of George Stout. And in particular, another of our board members and the treasurer, Perry McGowan, was very involved in that, as well as a former board member with the, I think it's the Iowa connection that George Stout held as well. Which reminds me to say, and we'll hear more about this in the next session, but to some extent, we see ourselves as the successors to the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives team that was set up during the Second World War. Although today, with the advocacy that we've undertaken, with our ratification of the Hague Convention, and now with the establishment of the Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee, so many of these functions have now been transferred, as we will hear, to inside the US military as well, which is, again, one of our accomplishments. Cori, next. We have worked to raise awareness also about the dangers of armed conflict. We've issued a statement with 7 other, and I think there are additional heritage organizations over the past couple of weeks, including our statement on Ukraine. One of the problems we've had, which I'll mention, is that our outreach has to some extent been not as good as it could be, because our website has not been particularly functional. I imagine many of you have discovered this. And we are on the verge of relaunching the website in the next week or so. So please be on the lookout for that. We did post a statement on our Facebook page. We have a new Facebook page, so be sure that you visit that as well. And the statement on Ukraine was distributed through other forms of social media. So this is serving the dual purpose of raising awareness of the particular dangers to cultural heritage. I will say that Cori Wegener and somebody you'll hear from tomorrow, Hayden Bassett, were featured last week on the NewsHour on public broadcasting, and you can get that snippet as well on the internet, and you can listen to it that way. But the USCBS was responsible for the main drafting and coordinating amongst the different cultural heritage organizations that joined in our statement on Ukraine. I think that's probably the last line. Okay, future goals. Great, that's where I was going next. I've already mentioned the ratification of the second protocol. We want to continue to support the new section of the US Army, which is you'll hear more about in a few minutes. We also are working with UNESCO and other organizations on documenting heritage destruction and also making people aware of the heritage sites that exist and their preservation. We will continue to disseminate awareness and public outreach of the convention itself and additional responsibilities that the US has. Some of our activities and goals, which I've just mentioned, is to continue our public outreach. I've mentioned we will have a new website that will be launched very soon. We already have a new Facebook page. We'll be undertaking other social media outreach. We are partnering, as I've said, with other cultural heritage organizations. We have, for example, submitted comments related to the question of anti-money laundering regulations that are being introduced in the United States as a way of decreasing not only funding of armed conflict in other parts of the world, but also to prevent the US market from being a place where such objects may be imported. We also partnered in the last couple of months with the American Red Cross in their essay and art competition. The part I was involved in was the essays written by high school students, and they were quite good and knowledgeable. And the subject for this year was cultural property protection. We will continue with our public engagement and outreach. And we will, for example, be partnering with the Archaeological Institute of America and the Antiquities Coalition at the meetings next January, where, amongst other topics, we will talk about changes that have occurred in the US military, in public awareness, in the law, in humanitarian outreach efforts that we have made. This will take place in January at the AIA meetings that will be held in New Orleans. So these are some of the activities that we have coming up. We ask you, we're very happy that you're here for us today. Be aware that the program is being recorded, and you can, once we know where the recording will be posted, you will be sent a notice about where you can find it. So if you can't be with us for both days, feel free to join, to listen to the rest of the recordings for other programs. So we ask you to participate in our programs. We also are looking to expand speaker opportunities to come to schools, universities, arts organizations, to raise awareness about our activities. We have started this on a small scale. We'd like to expand that. Feel free to be in touch with us, send us your ideas, volunteer with us. And of course, we always ask for your membership and your financial support. So feel free to be in touch, and we look forward to working with you as partners. With this, I would like to turn to welcome Dr. Peter Stone, who, as Cori just mentioned, here's Peter, it will come as no surprise that he's been extraordinarily busy over the last few weeks, working with international organizations, Blue Shield International, UNESCO, of course, the Prince Claus Fund, the Olive Foundation, and others. But Peter is the president of Blue Shield International. Before that, he was the vice president, I think for a good many years. And he is also the UNESCO chair at Newcastle University in the UK. It's the UNESCO chair in cultural property protection and peace. There are several UNESCO chairs throughout the world. Here in the United States, we're probably not quite as familiar with those as other parts of the world are. But his title is unique, and he is the only UNESCO chair in this particular aspect of cultural property. He's been involved in cultural property protection since at least 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. And at the time he was named, and as he cautioned me to say, named too late as an advisor to the UK Ministry of Defense on the identification and protection of cultural property in Iraq. And with that, I will turn to Peter.
Patty, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this conference. If you just hold for a moment while I find the right presentation. And okay, I hope that I hope you can see that on your screens. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about Blue Shield International, the organization that I was elected as president for in 2020. And excuse me if I cough as I go along. I don't think it's anything COVID related. It's just my normal cough of the period. But before I talk specifically about Blue Shield, I always think it's worth just putting in a little bit of context as to what and why we do some of these things, and some of our ideas that permeate everything that we do. So I'm frequently questioned about why to protect cultural property and not people. And the simple answer to that is people first, always. But cultural property protection is about people, about their cultural property, and the two are completely intertwined and indivisible. And I apologize for this slide at one level, but just to underline that indivisibility. In the fighting in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, a population of a village was taken to a deep hole, machine gunned into that hole, but the hole was then not completely filled up with the earth that had been dug out to make the hole, but the majority of the material put back in the hole was the remains of the mosque of the people who had just been machine gunned into that hole. The burial of people and their cultural property in the same grave, I think, is a testimony to the fact that these two issues are completely indivisible. And just to take us back, and I know this is sort of, module 101 for many of us, but it's always worth just thinking about why is cultural property or heritage important? Because it gives that tangible and intangible link to the past, which places people in the present. It gives people a sense of place, identity, and belonging. An individual without a memory is a dysfunctional individual. A community without a memory can become a dysfunctional and unstable community. And for either the military or humanitarian sectors, allowing it to be damaged may, almost certainly will, cause problems for their deployment. Always people first, but that means as much protecting their cultural property. And a mantra that I come back to is that what we are trying to do, that military or uniform sector, as we call it, the humanitarian sector and the heritage sector, our end aspiration, even though we start in very different places, is to build healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable communities. But of course, cultural property protection comes with a health warning, because it defines who belongs, and of course, who does not. who is included and who is specifically excluded, therefore. And it can be used as a frequent tool of war, and it has been recently. Think of that, the conflict in former Yugoslavia, the ISIS attacks on the Yazidi, for example. But much more importantly, it can be used, especially during stability operations, but before conflict, as a vehicle for understanding, mutual recognition, and peace building. And so just because it has a downside doesn't mean we shouldn't have the upside as well. We can omit it and leave it out, but that can become a serious threat, or we could include it across all three sectors and it will provide a key contribution. Okay, so just to pick almost a point in history at random, but there was massive destruction of cultural property with almost no or negligible interest in its protection during the First World War. However, in that First World War, cultural property protection was seen as an opportunity by some. In 1917, the British occupation of Jerusalem came alongside a proclamation in which the force commander, Allenby, proclaimed that every sacred building, monument, holy spot, shrine, traditional site of the three religions will be maintained and protected. And to underline that Allenby came in peace, he walked into Jerusalem rather than riding on a horse or tank, but also followed through the next day with protecting all of those sites. But somebody on his staff, and this is one of my numerous retirement projects just to find out who it was thinking a little bit more deeply, because what they did was deploy Indian Muslim troops under Allenby's command to protect the Islamic sites. And because of that, it meant that there was no opposition to Allenby's military occupation of Jerusalem during the First World War. That very, very clever, simple act of deploying particular troops to protect particular monuments essentially disarmed any potential opposition to that occupation. As soon as the military moved on, there was significant opposition, of course, to the political occupation of Jerusalem. But stability policing there, excellent cultural property protection, with a little bit in the quote thrown in of propaganda about how nasty the Germans were. We've heard about the Second World War and the monuments men and the aspiration for our modern incarnations to reflect those. But let's just take a snapshot of what happened in the 10 years following the Second World War. So firstly, in 1945, UNESCO was created, and it was created to develop world peace through education, science, and culture. And you can see here the famous opening words of the UNESCO Convention, that since war's beginning in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defences of peace must be constructed. But more importantly, a few lines down in that constitution, political and economic agreements are not enough to build lasting peace. Peace must be established on the basis of humanity's moral and intellectual solidarity, again, through education, science, and culture. So a major step there with the creation of UNESCO. In 1948, the Genocide Convention was agreed and put into international law. But the early draft of that convention also had an implication, excuse me, in that there were two forms of genocide identified: barbarism, genocide against people, and cultural genocide against their cultural property, as it would have been termed at the time. That second part of genocide was taken out of the convention on the insistence of the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and a few other countries, mainly because they were concerned about how it might be used in terms of their treatment of indigenous cultures and indigenous cultural property. Also in 48, there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, establishing the right to participate in cultural life and scientific advancements. And then, of course, particularly for us, the 54 Convention. But the people who were at the 54 Convention conference, who finalized the drafting of it, and immediately following, explicitly expected a new organization, what was then referred to as the Blue and White Shield, to be created and to become the cultural equivalent of the ICRC. That, of course, didn't happen in 1954. But before I continue that story of the Blue Shield, just to flag, and as already been mentioned, I got involved in this mainly in 2003. And I had a whole variety of different responses from, as you can see on the screen, heritage gets destroyed during conflict. It's war. However much we shout, nothing can be done. And I just fundamentally disagreed and disagree with that. But I do agree that shouting doesn't help. And I'll come back to that point. Secondly, talking to the military, in particular in relation to Iraq, provides support for an illegal war. And again, I just didn't and I don't agree. Interestingly, the military and humanitarian responses at the time were also pretty negative. And I paraphrase, but I got this response from the military countless times. Dr. Stone, while I love visiting old places and museums, protecting them is simply not a military priority. And my view at that time, and that is still there, is that that's an opinion that needed and continues to be needed to be changed. And the humanitarian one, which surprised me, when I was first approached, I said, well, surely the ICRC does this. And the response from the ICRC was that they were concerned with the protection of people and didn't want to muddy the water by also looking after old things. Another opinion that needed and continues to be needed to be changed. So what happened in what went wrong in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts since 2003? There have been large books written on that, and I'm not going to go into them. Not enough troops frequently, a political and military failure to comprehend post-conflict scenarios, to understand the importance of cultural heritage and historic relationships, but also critically the failure of the heritage sector to engage with the military as it had done during the Second World War, and a failure of the humanitarian sector to identify cultural property protection as an aspect of their work. And in Iraq, that failure led to the looting of almost all national institutions to do with culture. But it also contributed to the vacuum of authority and increased opposition by the population to the coalition presence, a almost diametrically opposite situation as 1917 in Jerusalem. And here you have the epitome of that distinction, the destruction of the Golden Mosque in Samarra in Iraq, where no heritage sites, no religious sites were protected by the coalition troops at all. And the destruction of the Al-Aqshari Mosque in Samarra, usually identified by commentators as the tipping point from a population increasingly fed up with the presence of the coalition into the full-scale sectarian civil war that took the coalition 5 years worth of bad publicity, 5 years worth of additional casualties and of additional fatalities. And that was an avoidable event had only somebody listened or read their history books. So to come to what I've been asked to talk about, my apologies, but the Blue Shield, 42 years late, not bad going, created in 1996 as an independent, impartial, neutral NGO under Dutch law, comprising the founding 4 organizations for museums, archives, libraries, and monuments and sites, and national committees. And today there was a meeting of national committees where we had a presentation by the Belgium National Committee, the first ever national committee of the Blue Shield. And we welcomed 2 new national committees, Slovakia and Niger, now making 30 national committees internationally of BSI. And together they elect an international board, and with a small secretariat funded through the UNESCO chair at Newcastle, together that board secretariat are called Blue Shield International. And we're named obviously after the 54 convention and its emblem. Here's one of the central team, Michael Dela Cruz, known to many of you, working on a project recently in Honduras, bringing together US Southcom, but also Honduran and other local militaries and heritage professionals. The key thing with the 54 convention is it is essentially a peacetime convention. If you don't prepare in peacetime, then there's little chance of good cultural property protection in conflict or following disaster. And unfortunately, one of the problems of the current issues in Ukraine is that nobody in Ukraine, not least the heritage sector, believed that the Russian Federation was actually going to invade. And so very little, with some notable exceptions, but very little preparation work was done. And so we have seen a mad scrabble and a disorganized scrabble of trying to help and trying to support. The 2 key bits, obviously, from, well, certainly from my perspective in the 54 convention, the concepts of safeguarding and respecting cultural property, the issue of military necessity, and then the addition of clear criminal liability under the 2nd protocol. So our primary context as Blue Shield, but in particular Blue Shield International, is the 54 Convention and its protocols, underpinned by wider UN and UNESCO strategic agendas, also being aware of the Sustainable Development Goals and disaster risk issues such as the Sendai Framework. And we see cultural property protection as a multi-sector responsibility, but critically also opportunity. And there you've got the cast of the of a TV program organized by the Argentinian National Committee of the Blue Shield. To deliver that, though, we have to work with partners, and we have to work with the uniform sector, the humanitarian sector, and the heritage sector. And we have to understand the political, legal, and media environments in which this work has to take place. And the image there, training colleagues from the Irish Defence Forces. So we envisage that as a triangle. And as all good triangles, this one has 3 points. And the points are the heritage, humanitarian, and uniform sectors. And by uniformed, I mean not only armed forces, but also emergency services, police, customs, etc. And as described to me by a US officer mid last year, that even though those 3 sectors start from completely different starting points, they all have the end aspiration of healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable communities. And because then they can either go home or get on with their own work. And as that American officer commented, the space in the triangle is the safe space where there are no stupid questions, and we can begin to work together to build a partnership that moves towards that common objective. But we can't do that with understanding the wider context of politics, the legal issues, increasingly important, the media, and in particular social media, but they're down at the bottom, why we do it, to create those healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable communities. So that's how we envisage Blue Shield. A key issue which has been sort of touched on a little bit by Patty is that Blue Shield International is an independent, impartial, and neutral organization. It does not and will not publicly denounce any particular parties to any armed conflict. And that enables to work as for us to work behind the scenes with everybody. And it's a key element of our longer term aspiration to become that cultural equivalent of the ICRC. Now, there are some national committees who find that by their nature less easy to comply with. You are dealing with, in most instances, national military, national politicians, national departments of culture, etc. And in some instances, there is a desire to speak out about a particular conflict. Now, the US National Committee were very careful in maintaining that independent, impartial, and neutral stance in their statement. Other national committees haven't done the same, and that's, to me, fine, because we can see that as a distinction, just as there is this distinction between the ICRC and national societies of the Red Cross, so there can be between BSI and national committees of the Blue Shield. So we work things out. For the first 8 years, I said shouting wasn't a good idea. Probably for the first 8 years or so after 2003, I did a lot of shouting, talking to or shouting at anybody in uniform who would stand still long enough for me to shout, saying that they needed to look after cultural property and heritage because it was their responsibility. And it took me, as I say, 8 or 9 years, because I'm a slow learner, to realize that that was getting me nowhere. And one of the things I had to do was learn a new language, which was military. And I had to talk about not that heritage site, but that potential force multiplier. I had to talk about not the heritage community, but a group that J9 needed to interact with, and so on. And what I also did was begin to map out in an article that was first published in the archaeological journal Antiquity, the 4 times, or the which got called the 4 tier for reasons I won't go into now, but the 4 times that we needed to work with those in uniform. Long-term education and training, immediately pre-deployment about specific training, during conflict, reach back and support, post-conflict, absolutely crucial to the longer-term attainment of those healthy, peaceful, secure, sustainable communities. But in the winter of 2013, that was republished in the military journal British Army Review, and I'll come to that in just a moment. So what Blue Shield is trying to do at the moment, and the board is trying to do, is unify the thinking of those 30 now national committees in existence and a further 10 or more under preparation, so that we are all speaking and talking in the same language. And we've identified these 6 areas of activity that BSI, and we ask all national committees to plan to and report on. There isn't a need to prioritize in this order, and there isn't a need for every national committee to address every 6 of those areas of activity on an annual basis. But what we want people to do is think in terms of all 6 of them in, as I say, planning and crucially reporting. And that's one of the critical aspects of our work, because that's one of the things that external funders will begin to look for, that coherence and continuity across the board in what we as an organization globally do and aspire to do. In the same way, we've identified 8 threats to heritage in conflict. So it's not just the fact that things get damaged and destroyed during conflict through collateral damage. The 2 biggest issues are lack of planning and lack of political, military, humanitarian awareness. And if we can get those 2 right, a lot of the other 6 will almost take care of themselves. And again, we try to get everybody at all national committee levels thinking about this. And the image there is a training session for the then newly established UK Cultural Property Protection Unit, but with colleagues from 6 other armed forces internationally attending that course as well. So some of the stuff that we're doing from BSI at the moment is training for national committees. Those of you who've been involved, we finished Block 1 training, which was all available online in the period before Christmas of last year. And we hope we will launch the Block 2 set of training materials in the next few weeks. Things have got a little slower because of our work in Ukraine. We've developed a whole series of formal links with partners to establish greater cooperation, and I'll talk about some of those in a moment. We've been working very closely with NATO on a template for targeting information for cultural property. In other words, this is why you shouldn't be targeting those places, and providing cultural property what NATO call injects problems into exercises, and that's my colleague Emma Cunliffe doing that on a tabletop exercise with NATO planners. We've been working with the UN peacekeeping deployment in Lebanon and the Lebanese armed forces since 2013, when we worked with UNESCO on a first training program. A few weeks ago, I led a training program for the UN peacekeeping school in Ireland, where there were troops from a number of European countries present who deploy overseas as peacekeepers, and looking at the CPP aspects of that. And we've been working on CP issues in various parts of the world. As you can imagine, Afghanistan and Ukraine, you've seen Honduras, but we are also looking at Georgia and Estonia. And unfortunately, those Georgia, we had a program going already. Estonia, we had aspired to have a program with over the last 18 months, which kept getting postponed because of COVID. But they now have gone right up the priority list alongside all of those other countries that may be under threat following the conflict in Ukraine. And we are searching for medium or long-term funding for a central team, because at the moment, that central team, that secretariat, as I said earlier, is provided through funding from or through the UNESCO chair at Newcastle. At the moment, that finishes on the 31st of December 2023, and there's no guarantee that we will have that extended, although the aspiration is that it will be. So we have to do all of that. So how are we doing? Very quickly. Cori mentioned the list of cultural property that the US committee have led on. With a little bit of support from the UK, they produced this list for Libya, and the protection of this site at Ras Al Margeb gave something that NATO were extraordinarily unused to, which was good publicity. And as a result of all of the good publicity, they instituted an internal review which recommended that NATO should have a NATO-wide CPP policy. We got a directive, a step towards a policy in 2018, and there is still planning going on for that policy. So there's a direct link in influencing a multinational organization from the work that one national committee, supported by another, delivered back in 2011. These things don't happen quickly. Another military response a few years ago now, but the coalition forces taking Raqqa from ISIS, and I'm not going to read out this quote from Rupert Jones, who was the second in command of the coalition forces at the time, but you can see that there was a 2,500 meter medieval wall going around the old city. Because of the pressure about the value of CPP that Blue Shield and others have put on the military, the coalition took that very seriously and targeted 2 25-meter sections only. And by doing that, by targeting them in the right area, they were able to get rid of ISIS from inside Raqqa and only damage 50 meters of 2,500 1,000 meters of wall. I think pretty good cultural property protection and awareness. I said that 2013 four-tier article was reproduced in British Army Review, and Colonel Tim Purbrick, who was then at military UK Army headquarters, claims to have gone into Army HQ on the 23rd of December 2013, hiding from his 4 children 2 days before Christmas, and read that article in its entirety while standing at the magazine rack. And certainly what is true, he then went and found my phone number and phoned me up, and I was sitting in my room at university, hiding from 4 young children 2 days before Christmas. And the disembodied voice from Tim's call was, Prof Stone, you don't know me, but I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tim Purbrick, and I think we should have a chat. And from that conversation, that directly led to the UK's CPPU being established. But this list put together by Tim to convince the UK Army of the value of CPP to Army deployments. And again, I'm not going to read it out to you, but the one that Tim underlines is it is a moral obligation to the community. And then if you don't do it, it can lead to alienation and undermining and forced credibility. So that's a real positive. In 2020, the major explosion at Beirut port devastated parts of the city of Beirut. Because of the work we'd been doing with UNIFIL since 2013, 7 years worth of partnership, when they were given permission to move outside their normal area of responsibility, one of the first things they did to go and help with the devastation in Beirut was to phone Blue Shield Lebanon and BSI and say, is there any cultural property that we can help with? And that led to working with LAF, Lebanese Armed Forces, and UNIFIL under the auspices of architects provided by Blue Shield Lebanon and the NGO Biladi in Lebanon, and the long-term protection of a couple of major buildings in Beirut. That would never have happened without the long-term peacetime partnership and building of trust between those 3 organizations, which led to Blue Shield signing an MOU with UNIFIL, as we have already signed one with NATO. And there is a Lebanese Armed Forces embryonic CPP unit under construction. And then the ICRC, and there's a group, including my predecessor as president, Karl Habsburg, and the person on the other side of the lady in the middle is Yves Dacour, then Director General of UNESCO. And Yves realized the narrow-mindedness, let's say, of the original ICRC response in 2003. And again, you can read the quote from him when we signed the MOU with the ICRC. Sadly, COVID has put pay to quite a lot of the things that we were planning to do, but we are now just slowly building up that relationship again with the ICRC. There is still an enormous way to go before we are the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross, but I describe this as we are putting the foundation stones of a large building that needs to be constructed before we can be. If we didn't put those foundation stones into place now, then it wouldn't be in my children's lifetime or in their children's lifetime. We won't be the cultural equivalent in my lifetime, but if we don't start now, we never will be. Thank you very much for listening. And
think you need to stop sharing.
Yeah, there it goes.
There we go. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for that. Really helped to introduce not only Blue Shield International, but the whole Blue Shield movement. We are going, there was one comment in the chat or in the chat, and I will pass that on to Peter about how to get some training in Pakistan. So that's something that we can certainly discuss. And quickly, while Cori sets up the next panel, I want to only clarify what both Peter and Cori said, but I want to make sure it's clear. In the case of the US committee, we have no connection to the US government. We are not part of the military. We're not part of the State Department. We have never received any funding from the US government in any of its sections. We see our role as an independent NGO, or as Cori said, a not-for-profit organization. And we raise money from private foundations and of course from memberships, but our independence is a very important part, and we see our role as trying to keep the US government on the right side of all these humanitarian issues, including the cultural heritage aspects. So thank you so much, Peter. I know there have been some comments coming in. Actually, some of them I can't see, probably because I'm not a host. But I think, Cori, if you're ready, I think we should keep moving on to the next panel. Yes, here comes Cori.
Yes, thanks, Patty. So in the interest of trying to keep to time, I think we're going to go ahead and drive on to the next session, which is about the various efforts. We couldn't include every country's efforts to perform the military measures of the Hague Convention, but we've invited a few really key guests here today to help us explore this important aspect of the 1954 Hague Convention. So I wanted to just say a couple of words about what that is, how the Hague Convention does this. And I'd like to ask my other panelists, I see we have Captain Timothee Berre here. Could my other two panelists, Commander Curtis and Colonel Scott DeJesse, go ahead and take yourselves off mute and appear before us. There we go. All right. We're all here. The band's all here. Okay. So regarding the 1954 Hague Convention, I wanted to just, I think it bears repeating for those of you who might not remember the military measures of the Hague Convention. So in Chapter 1, Article 7, it outlines the military measures. And this is sort of further down in the treaty. The treaty begins with the definition of cultural property and discussions about how states parties agree to deal with cultural property and the protections that it must provide and agree to on the domestic side. But then it goes further into the military measures. And that's that the high contracting parties undertake to introduce in time of peace into their military regulations or instructions provisions as may ensure observance of the present convention and to foster in the members of their armed forces a spirit of respect for the culture and cultural property of all peoples. And then the second paragraph, the high contracting parties undertake to plan or establish in peacetime within their armed forces, services or specialist personnel whose purpose will be to secure respect for cultural property and to cooperate with the civilian authorities responsible for safeguarding it. So we're very fortunate to have here with us today some of those specialist personnel, experts in the cultural heritage field, as well as military personnel in and of their own right. So I'm just going to welcome, in order of their presentations today, Colonel Scott DeJesse. Scott's a longtime friend and colleague. He's a curator, a museum professional, and an artist, but he's also a colonel in the U.S. Army and a former armor officer, but we will forgive him for that. He is the 38 Golf Program Director of the Strategic Initiatives Group of the U.S. Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command, and the leader of the 6 Victor Cultural Heritage Officer Program. Commander Roger Curtis is with us today. He's a commander of the British Army Cultural Property Protection Unit. In his civilian life, he's a building surveyor and works to repair and conserve historic buildings and structures. And he's newly taken over the CPP unit. And then finally, Captain Tim Berre. He's a cultural property protection expert with the French Army, and he works with the French Army's museums and heritage system. And he's also been deployed with the French military to Mali. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with Colonel Scott DeJesse. Scott.
Okay, well, I think the best way here is I'm going to share my entire screen with y'all and go right to the presentation. Can you see that, Cori?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Well, I appreciate everybody's time here, and I'll try to be brief and give you a kind of a wide snapshot of what we're doing at the U.S. Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command, USCBS, as I will refer to it as that point. So I want to discuss this in the context of how the U.S. Army fights. So here's an open source snapshot of the strategy that the U.S. Army follows to develop its force for the future. Just a few of the comments that have already happened this morning or today, this afternoon, depending on your time zone, that talking in the language and discussing it from the point of the military perspective on how to get them to step forward in this effort. So it's all about language and understanding military processes. So on the initial part here, looking at this from manning, organization, training, equipment, and leading, and then to doctrine and how the capability is built across. And we're very much driven at USCBS in this direction. So talking about personnel and what USCBS has been doing, this is part of the 6 Victors Heritage and Preservation Officers fall into the military governance specialist program that was pretty much established in 2015. And it's a program that basically tries to bring in civilian expertise that can't really be developed in the military, inherently civilian professions. So initially, the first few years were very slow going. In 2019, when I joined up with USCBS headquarters, an opportunity presented itself, and I got tasked with this job as the director of the program from the USCBS operational side. We've had significant gains on this when we only really started with 30 personnel over 18 different jobs, and one of them is Heritage and Preservation Officers. We've now led up to the recruitment of about 250 candidates. Currently, we have 38 Gulf, 6 Victors, Heritage and Preservation Officers in the Army Reserve. 12 are additional candidates are pending direct appointments. That's going to be happening very shortly. One will get pinned on next weekend, becoming a captain, and then we have several after that. And then there's another 12 officers that are going to be going in front of the selection board in May. So hopefully by mid-23, we'll be at about 30 plus Heritage and Preservation Officers, which is exciting to have and establishing that capability. So looking at the organization, how we organize and prepare. The 38 Gulf, 6 Victors in USCBS are in Civil Affairs Commands, which is the 1-star level commands in USCBS. And that's where the operational forces sit for civil affairs. There's only one place where this capability sits, and it's in USCBS. And these KCOMs are aligned across geographical combatant commands. We know there's only going to be around 30 odd 6 Victors in the current structure of the forces, that we know that this expertise and personnel will be cross-leveled across the KCOM. So if we have a 6 Victor that's specialized in relation to cultural heritage of Africa, but they might be assigned to the command that's, in California that looks at the Indo-PACOM, the Pacific Command, the idea of cross-leveling them for maybe a task, an assignment, or their expertise of sharing. We're really focused on cultural property protection in the context of civil affairs activities and multi-domain operations, which means we're here to support the mission. Part of supporting the mission is making sure that we're adhering to all our legal requirements, such as the Hague Convention. But we talk in military terms, and we're really pushing hard on that. And the idea of being focused on institutionalization, that it's not, shouldn't be done through serendipity. That previously before, it's like, oh, I happen to know a person and I've got this network. It's like, no, we're really trying to drive in these pathways of if there's an issue that arises, that there's one pathway to follow. And that's the way to make sure that all the right organizations are connected. And we're doing this through CivMil partnerships, international mill-to-mill partnerships. So our motto is a newly adopted motto, is protection through partnership. None of us can do this alone. Then looking at how we train. So yes, 6 Victors do training with deploying civil affairs units. Also, just recently, we're pretty pleased. I know I am pleased that Lieutenant Colonel Michael De La Cruz and Captain Bill Welsh managed to get on, through official requests, get on a mission and to conduct by the commander, the Joint Task Force commander's request, doing cultural property protection training. So this is security cooperation. And that's the way the US military functions, with training with partners and with host nation, government organizations, and our military partners. So finding the official routes and going that way. So my hat's off to Lieutenant Colonel De La Cruz, great job. And we're focused on those efforts with security cooperation with the current lines of effort that are in that security cooperation. The idea of, for SOUTHCOM, for US Southern Command, it's about countering malign activities, building partnerships, and readiness. So those are the focus that we discuss. It's like, you have a great opportunity, the way we express it, you have a great opportunity through cultural property protection to really drive those lines of effort, cement them with the Joint Task Force that are deployed across the world. Like I always say, hey, we have the secret sauce. Nothing says, nothing describes to a partner that they're important as helping protecting who they are and their meaning in their society. Training wise, with the help of the Smithsonian, which is like one of the best partnerships we could possibly imagine. The Army Monuments Officer Training course that's been done virtually under COVID conditions, but we'll have our first in-person training that will happen this August. And really pleased to say that it's with 15 US military personnel, along with 10 international partners from around the world. And we're really excited about that, getting the perspective. And once again, it's protection through partnership. Equipping. Happy to say that the US Army, Department of the Army, has approved a cultural property protection brassard, which means that all US Army soldiers that are conducting CPP activities and conducting training are authorized to wear this brassard. Like basically goes over the left patch there, and it's above the UC-CAPOC patch right there. So not walking around post doing whatever, it's specifically for doing training in cultural property protection activities. So that just came through at the beginning of this year. We're pleased about that. And that meets the requirements for the 1954 Hague Convention. So we're pretty excited. The idea of leading. The thought is that how do you get expertise to our military personnel, staff, decision makers? In the 6 Victor program, I would say is a spearhead for the Army, and especially for the Army Reserves and UC-CAPOC, because the 38 Gulf program really has been led by the heritage and preservation efforts because of the partnerships with the Smithsonian, because everyone can identify it. And because of the current situation in the world and in Europe, that there's definitely a need for information relating to what Russia's been up to. So with our partnerships with the Smithsonian and the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab, that we can provide information to our commands and saying, hey, this is the activities that are taking place but it's the idea we have to put in their context. So I'm going to move to this next slide here. And this diagram is like, well, if you look to the left with our partner organizations and, with the SI specific data, which is skill identifier and 38 Gulf terminology, how does that really get to the people that need to know in military leadership? So looking from left to right, it's the idea you have cultural property information. Then right next to it, you have the specialty function teams, which is where the 38 Gulfs sit and USCKPOC. And then to the civil affairs commands and across to the geographical combatant commands and units that are deployed. So what the 38 Gulf 6 Victors operate as, along with the advisors and doing cultural property protection, is that we take information from civil partners and integrate it and validate it and bring it into military governance sectors, areas that kind of into militarizees the language, governance, economic, social, and rule of law, and then bringing that across operational variables of political, military, economic, social information and infrastructure and physical terrain and time, and converting that language over to our military brothers and sisters in uniform. And then that gets converted at that point, the specialty function areas of all the civil affairs and 38 Gulfs come across and then integrate this information for a common operational picture, which then can be turned over and handed to the military commands for their common operational picture for joint planning processes and conducting activities in security cooperation. So you have to have a language, you have to have the expertise, and you have to know where the barriers are. And this is what we propose, and what we're operating on right now is the way to drive this information forward. And if you see that the arrow is going back with RFIs, is requests for information, it's like, all right, well, once they see, military commanders and decision makers would see this information, well, how does it get back and through the organization to our partners and continue the discussion? So this is kind of a loop process. It's not one way, it cycles back. So showing the cultural property issues that I know that military leadership is interested in because they see the threats that are happening to the population. This is one way of leading the way for other areas of expertise in economics, governance, rule of law, that where our civilian experts sit, and how to get that information over to our military partners. Looking at doctrine, right now working with proponents on recrafting GTA 41-01002, the Arts, Monuments, and Archives Guide, and also with Peacekeeping Stability Operations Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, on developing a measuring progress and lines of effort through cultural property. And that's based off of the MPEACE product that was developed by the Institute for Peace, PKSOI, U.S. Army engineers. And that's basically it, what I have for the group. Pending any of your questions, I'll hand it back to you, Cori. Thank you for your time.
I think we'll try to hold the questions to the end and continue with Commander Curtis.
Right, well, thank you very much. And I'll just carry on and share some slides and pass through a few notes on where we are. Can I just check, Cori, you can see that slide, please?
No, I can't. We may need to enable you to share screen. And I don't have the power to do that. Karen, I'm hoping you can allow Commander Curtis to share his screen.
Cori, my screen says that all participants can share, so all panelists can share. So I'm not sure what to do.
Can you try it again?
Let me just try again, okay? Okay, now we're good.
Yes, we have it. You might just want to put it into full screen mode.
There we are. Full screen check.
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, well, thank you for the chance to speak, and I'll follow on from Colonel Scott. Very conscious of the time, and I don't want to hold things up too much. But so my name is Roger Curtis. I was in the regular service in the Royal Navy up until 1998, and then joined the reserve, and then more recently the Cultural Property Protection Unit. So I'll run down really what we've been doing since our formation to give you a feeling of how it works from a UK military perspective. And it was really kicked off formally with the signing by the UK government of the Hague Convention and the protocols in 2017. And then the UK Ministry of Defence instructed by Parliament to deliver the military capability that was read out by Cori for member states to deliver. So that was taken forward by the Field Army, but important to note it's a tri-service unit, so it has a function over and beyond that of the Army alone. 15 posts, and then a little bit of early doctrine that I think Colonel Tim obviously had quite a big part in. And probably appreciate from a UK perspective, we sit under what is termed a human security grouping, which is about essentially protection of civilians and activities around the battlefield. And freshly out, just before Christmas of 2021, is JSP 985, which is human security. And so we sit under that in terms of the functionality and its deliverables. In terms of the doctrine note and reading quite a good grab to get a feeling for what it means to the UK Army, 1905, it's available on the internet, so it's open source. It's very much land-based, but it describes it nicely in about 20, 30 pages or so. Lots of pictures for people like me, a good summary of the rationale behind it all over and above the requirements of the Hague Convention, and quite a lot about improving the mission and actually delivering a better task. And as well as Dr. Stone mentioned, it also covers quite a few useful historic examples where things have gone right and also where things have gone wrong. So capability development of the unit itself, and again, I'll skip this, or I'll skim this list rather. As I said, 15 reservists, background architects, archaeologists, building surveyors like myself, conservators, collections, cultural policy. Tri-service, we've got one R&R, which is myself, hope to get another one quite soon, and then one auxiliary RAF officer. And the criteria is a qualification in a relevant cultural historical topic, experience in the sector, and being active in the sector. It's quite important to us that officers are in that world and working in that world, and preferably that they're in the reserve already, although we've recruited quite a few. Our special to arms course was run, the first one for us was in 2019. Some of you here were familiar with that. And actually COVID has really hit us hard in terms of following up that and taking it forward. Recruiting and training ongoing. And then of course, there's the formal UK government obligations of taking forward the recommendations of the Hague Convention internally. And they got a list through to NATO of the UKCP in 2021. Bit of discussion about format of that, but that's a more detailed GIS discussion. So going forward then with our training and development, very much taking the view that we need to get it right with ourselves, get ourselves trained, get those immediately around us in the Ministry of Defence trained and associated tasks. So this is our weekend in July last year, held at Edinburgh Castle with some colleagues from Historic Environment Scotland who helped us on an evacuation exercise in one of the blocks at Edinburgh Castle, handling objects, security, protection from damage, and a lot of the things that you'll be familiar with and we're seeing played out. It was a paper exercise. We're very early in this journey, but certainly Historic Environment's collection staff are pretty swept up in this. So it was us who were learning from them in this particular instance. It's perhaps important to realize in terms of delivery, we're set up to support defence activity as requested and directed. We're a tactical level formation. We support operations. And at the moment for the UK, that's really at company level. So quite targeted, quite modest, and really trying to get them to develop a better understanding of the environments in which they're operating. So it's not always that standard Hague Convention lists, important though they are, and in which we do train, but sometimes what might be called reconnaissance operations as well. what's important to communities. We don't do restitution or crime directly, but we're quite close to those who do, and certainly would advise in a conflict situation on how that is applied. And I think we all know that heritage crime is quite closely linked with other crime and infringements such as threat financing, trafficking, narcotics. And these are the touch points for military forces. And if you address these CPP issues, you often address these, which is all about improving the overall mission and providing that improved service to the environment you're in. And I think starting is integrating into UK military training, perhaps what was referred to as Tier 1 earlier. And at the moment, we're supporting deployed UK forces in Kosovo and in Mali. And that really starts with scoping out CPP and location analysis in areas of interest before people start going. Emerging areas of activity, such as in underwater cultural heritage, which is an interesting journey. And then working with other armed forces on CPP development and implementation. So we work closely with Colonel Scott's unit. We've worked with the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, recent training in Dublin with the Irish Defence Force, and we've got training coming up in Austria in the autumn. As recommended by the Blue Shield, preparation and dialogue with stakeholders in the sector before the crisis, or as a background of activity, working with Blue Shield and other in the sector. And I think getting the CPP understanding and knowledge into the minds of the military, and in our view, exercise design and delivery is a very important way of doing this. Military folk, as everyone else, are rushed off their feet and busy, and unless it's an imperative in the inbox right in front of them, it tends not to happen. So an example is a coming up NATO exercise, Baltops, which will be set in the Baltic area, where we are designing CPP serials for that delivery. And I mentioned the UNESCO report. How does it look like closer to the troops then? The obligation to train our own forces, and our route for that is the pre-deployment training. So before people go, they get that training, and engendering a culture of respect and protect. Understanding the management of cultural property in the host nation. So how do they look after it and manage it? Everybody, all countries are different in how this is approached. And also understand the cultural landscapes and the people that you will be working with, the communities you will be around. Knowing what's there, Colonel Scott touched on a recognized land picture, and also what's not there and why that might be the case. So they get a written brief for the operations team on the host nation CP and the background. They get the brief, and often as part of that pre-deployment training, they have a short exercise training period, normally just a couple of days, with a cultural property protection scenario built into that. And then we would give a reach back support to the CPPU, whereby those troops abroad can call back to our headquarters at 77 Brigade, and thus to ourselves. And this happens on a bi-weekly basis for the Mali operation, and similarly for the work in Kosovo. This is kind of what it looks like. Captain Susanna Joy doing a briefing to the D Squadron Lancers before they went to Kosovo in September 20. That's all ranks there, and then the written material goes to the ops officer and folk directly concerned with operational planning. I'll stop there because I'm very conscious of time, and very pleased to show around our new logo that we've got quite recently. So we're going to stick that on everything we possibly can. And as Colonel Scott indicated, we do have the blue flash, which is mandated to be worn on our uniform when we're conducting this related duty. So thank you for that, and I'll stop on the sharing and let Tim progress.
Thank you very much, Commander Curtis. And we'll proceed with Captain Timothee Berre.
So does it work okay?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Cori, for inviting me to speak about the French implementation of the Hague Convention and what is going on inside of the French army. So I want to give you just a brief summarize of what we are doing currently, but we are a lot inspiring us of past experiences. So we know before the Hague Convention, and it's a long story, that soldiers like to loot and to disrespect cultural property, but now it's gonna to change. And inside of the French army, so we start to effectively protect cultural property during World War I, when we set our first cultural property protection unit in 1917. We also had 3 platoons. On that time, we were working at an army level to protect, to evacuate, safeguard, and collecting public as well as private artifact collection, and to try to preserve building from German shelling in northern France. Also during World War II, especially after 1934, we set a specific unit again at the French Army General Staff to prepare in case of a new war against the German. And we also set one platoon at an army level with 10 company in every military region in France. So after the French fall in 1940, they could say that they evacuated more than 100,000 artifacts, and they also protect every cathedral in northern France against shelling. They also and they worked after the victory of Germany, but they quickly work again in 1943 with US monuments men will really revive the spirit of what the French did, and we also start collaboration in cultural property protection inside of the army. So until that time, French is still working to look on a specific cultural property protection, as you see in Algeria or in Cambodia, where we had some specific task to protect monument in host nation and doing operations. Since we ratified the Hague Convention, 1954 Hague Convention, and the second protocol in 2017, we can say that we revived of what we were doing before. I can say that we almost forgot what we did in cultural property protection. And since we ratified the second protocol, and we saw the terrible destruction from ISIS in Iraq, in Syria, and therefore here at the French Army Heritage Office, we wanted to work again on that topic. You have to know that the French Army Heritage Office is a specific office at the French Army General Staff, and was in charge of the army collection of 16 museums, of more than 200 historic buildings, and almost 200,000 artifacts that we need to preserve, to collect, and to show to the public. And we also created a specific army curator branch in the French army in 1993, but we also started to work with our curators on cultural property protection in 2016. We first started to get a specific manual, a doctrine manual in 2014, and then we reedited it in 2018 after we ratified the Hague Convention, and it was also a starting point for us to set again specific cultural property protection capacity inside of the French army. So we are all currently full active duty officer, but we don't work a lot with reserve, but I hope in the next years we will try to gather more capabilities with reservists. Actually, until 2018, our focus was only in terms of legal obligations to be in the way of the Hague Convention. But then we started to switch our perspective in a more operational perspective, and to support.
Right, I'm going to be very, very quick. I just bunged you a couple of emails that hopefully gave a bit more info.
So we focus our view now on direct support to French Army operations, and therefore we wanted to switch to a more operative perspective like the US and the UK did. So what we said, and it's really, so we set a military committee for heritage protection, which is on a high level, on a chief of staff level. It's a meeting, annual meeting of generals who are in charge of, for example, cultural heritage as our generals, but also military intelligence, army operations, and geospatial data. So it's a high level, more focused on politics, but also to give us a specific order and to task a specific CPP group that we are leading with our army curators to work on these specific issues. We are also now since some months, so we are gathering other experiences alongside of our curators with legal advisor, with geospatial data officer, with civil military operations officer, to give us a specific training in cultural property protection to be our CPP Army specialist. So our first task during peacetime at the French Army Heritage Office is to give and to be the CPP expertise for the French Army. We also train our soldiers, so it goes from a specific to generic awareness, like you see on a wall. It's a urban training field for the army, where we put some blue shield just to explain and to put blue shield behind the eyes on the soldiers, that they know that there is cultural property. They need to be aware of what is it. And we go in a more deeper CPP training, like you see, for example, with we have a collaboration with the French Archaeological Institute to train engineers, for example, on archaeological issues. We also help our Army Operation Planning Command in terms of preparation of operation, to give the list, to put the list, to verify the list, and just to give our expertise. And it's also really, really useful to collaborate with the academic world, with other military unit like the US and the UK, because it's really helpful to share experiences. And we also set collaboration with UNESCO, with ALIF, and other international bodies. During operation, we also send actually only our army curators on the field to be the CPP specialist, but also the CPP advisor for our commanding generals and officers, to make them aware of what they need to respect, but also how they can use cultural property and cultural heritage for the success of their operations. We also are the liaisons officer for cultural heritage and CPP with the civilian and the organization of the host nation, and to be that link between the military language and the civilian and heritage community language. We also send officers in Mali, in Central Africa, or in Lebanon. And therefore, now we want to have a broad expertise, but a direct support to French military operations. So it's a long process, like we saw in the US as in the UK, but now with, unfortunately, what happened in Ukraine, we can have a direct effort on what what are the main objective for CPP within the army, and what we can give even for the civilian world, to explain that the army is respecting the Hague Convention, is preserving cultural heritage, and also safeguarding it from awareness to training to direct support operations. Also, collaboration is really a broad approach. We have a lot of collaboration inside of the army, from our military police to military border services, to military intelligence, to the firefighters brigade of Paris, which is a military unit, for example, are working in some museum like the Louvre. So we share training, as we also work with our French USAC Epoch in civil military cooperation, or with our legates on a ministerial level. We also have a lot of military collaborations, as international collaboration with NATO, MINUSMA, or some NATO Center of Excellence, as we want to have a closer collaboration with the French, with other departments like the French Ministry of Culture, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the French Homeland Security Services. So it's a really broad approach, but from our perspective, we can't work only alone on CPP, and we need to be all together, but to understand what are the issues for everybody, to have an effective result on the field in terms of CPP. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Captain Berre. So we do have a few minutes left for questions. If you have a question for our panelists, please put it into the Q&A and I'll share it with them. But I do have a couple of questions, and maybe we can start with you, Tim. What advice would you give for a young person who's currently at university and is considering a career in military cultural property protection? For the French military, what would your advice be?
Oh, actually, for us, there is two possibilities. The first one is to go as a regular NCO, as a regular officer, to have an operational experience, which is really needed when you are speaking and when you are advising your commanders, because you need, like Colonel Scott explained, you need to have this specific vocabulary, and you need to understand how is your commanders working, what is his need, and or you need and another. So be a regular officer, and then you can have you can get a specific expertise in CPP. This is one of our possibility to be French Army curators. Or there is another possibility. So be an heritage specialist, and then they engage to the French Army Heritage Office. And slowly we are giving them the military experience. So, but for us, we need both. We need really heritage specialists as so field army specialists. So I think with both, it's really it worked really better.
Thanks for that, Commander Curtis.
Yeah, I'd say pretty similar. I think probably we get quite a few inquiries about the CPPU, and our first recommendation at one level is to join the reserve forces. It is an officer entry for our specialization. Get some time under your belt in a unit doing Army, Navy, or Air Force things, which gives you that language that Tim mentioned, and then come across to the unit. Or if you've got slightly less time, join the unit direct as a special reserve officer, which is fine too. So you have this balance, as Tim alluded to. Are you soldier first, cultural specialist second, specialist first, with enough military to make it work? And I think that the trick is a balance of the two. everyone's got different experiences and at different stages of their own careers as well. So I think it's a mixed shop, but yeah, there's plenty of routes, but not many posts. That's the only thing.
True, true. Colonel DeJesse.
Just the thought is for those that want to, for the U.S. side that want to pursue to become a Six Victor, it's, know your job, know that you have your work that you're doing in the civilian sector, the expertise you develop. I mean, there's cultural heritage profession. There's so many different shades of expertise that, if you choose to pursue a career and do the work with the military as well, know your craft and practice your craft. And if you were to join us, the idea, it's our job to help convert and for you to develop the language. So it's kind of like if you want to serve, and serving is important with US and like the rest of our partners, it's a volunteer force. So just know your job in the civilian sector, and then with joining UCKPOC or becoming a heritage and preservation professional in the US military, it's the military job to kind of work with you, to train you, to kind of give you that language and understanding of processes from the military side.
Thanks. And then I have to ask this, and anybody can answer on the panel, but what do you see as the potential next steps to work with some of our colleagues who are facing the current armed conflict? Or have you had any type of communications with colleagues to try to find out what they may be doing in Ukraine or in the surrounding area?
Well, I'll just start off with, we all have our networks of people we know and people we've served with. And I've had the privilege to serve with Ukrainian officers, what they're going through. Right now, it's kind of, we have to sit and wait a bit, right? We take our orders from our leaders and then we go from there. But being prepared, it's kind of, if you were to think about in the context of 1940, there was a lot of sitting and waiting and not being involved directly in the conflict, at least for the US side. But the civilian experts, the organizations saying, hey, we see a problem, and the military slowly gets on board on the aspect of for this kind of situation in the civilian world. It's just right now our plans is just observing and gathering information, really getting our network straight on what we have to do. We can't reset every couple years. We have to establish the process, establish these partnerships. We all have shelf life, meaning that, we're not going to be in these positions, the exact positions, 5 years down the road. So whoever replaces us, it's like, these are the processes, these are the networks, and we continue to prepare for the future.
Tim, Roger, do you have anything to add to that? Oh, Roger, you're muted.
There's a real desire by politicians to be seen to be doing something quickly. And in reality, the military situation on the ground means that has a lot of restrictions and complexities. I think, as Colonel Scott indicated, there is quite a lot of recording going on. There are various initiatives to do that. And one has to be quite canny about who's doing the recording, to what standard, what purpose is that information going to be put to, and is the gathering of that material going to suit the end purpose, which could well be in several years' time. So there's quite a lot of considerations about that. Certainly within the UK, we are aware the Ministry of Defence has been approached by various cultural organisations across Europe about support and activity, and they're digesting what the art of the possible might be, and we've indicated where things might be doable and where things might not be doable.
Tim?
Actually, one issue that we are all facing, and especially what Ukraine is facing, is that you need to have a plan. It's a major major things when you are in the army. So have a plan for CPP, and you can only set this plan during peacetime. And during peacetime, it's really, really difficult to get awareness, to get a specific listening from politicians or from army commanders on a high level, because during peacetime there is no problem. So it's really, really a problem. But then when the war is coming, it's too late. So we see that there is a Ukrainian initiative to set a military CPP unit, but it's also a rush because it's too late. So be prepared, have a plan, or it will be much more difficult.
I think probably.
Sorry, Roger.
I think it's probably sharpened minds to focus on other areas in the world where preparation might be necessary. So I think it has probably given a bit of focus, and Professor Stone sort of indicated that. So that's probably where a few minds are going to be going.
You know, and I just want to reiterate, it's like, so for U.S. Personnel or that are on this call, the idea is really with the geographical combatant commands from the U.S. side, it's the focus is security cooperation. And the idea of putting this to moving this forward are efforts that working in combined environments and joint environments that we're all talking to each other and preparing. And the idea is that these commands with their operations, activities, and investments, excuse me, that the Hague Convention, which is part of our partnership to protect cultural property and being signatories of, that this can be put into those aspects. So it's like, you know, from the US military side, we usually state what we're up to by the commands. They list their priorities and keep on pushing to make this a priority across with all our different organizations. But the leaders listen to what they say. And it'll interesting when geographic combatant commands, when they all give their posture statements in the United States to Congress, what's said in there, and looking at basically what their organizations are doing, planning for. We have to slowly keep on pushing, and speak the language that will help support their mission, and they'll start responding correctly. I haven't met a commander who goes, oh, that's, you know, that's not really important. But the thing is, there's finite resources. You know, they've got a lot, they've got these military leaders have a lot of responsibility. So our job is to provide the assistance on help them achieve success. And as kind of Peter Stoner mentioned, we all have a mutual interest here, peace and stability. But our way is through cultural property.
Well, on that positive note, I'd like to thank the panelists today. Wonderful to see all of you, even on the Zoom machine. And I'm going to close our panel and hand it off to President Patty Gerstenblith.
Thank you, Cori. Thank you to the speakers, and of course to Peter earlier. This has really been so interesting and informative, and it's wonderful to see the advances and changes that have taken place over the last few years in at least these militaries, and of course we hope for more. I want to invite everyone, remind you that we will continue tomorrow at the same time, which is 10 o'clock on US East Coast time. Remind you also, you're all here, so you probably don't need the reminder, but to remind you that the United States has changed its time. We are in summertime now, so keep that in mind. We will have two really interesting sessions. The first one will be focusing on Ukraine and Russia, and the second one on the recent International Court of Justice decision in Armenia against Azerbaijan, where cultural heritage became part of the court's decision not under the Hague Convention, but under a different international convention. So it should prove to be a very informative and means of being updated on some of the most current events that are occurring in the cultural heritage protection field. So again, I thank you all for your attention. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.